Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the 12th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams. My name is Henry Badgery, and I'm the growth marketer here at Open Teams. In this episode, I was lucky enough to chat with Michael Meskes, who is the CEO of Credativ. What's Credativ? Credativ is an open source services provider that are best known for their work and expertise in PostgreSQL. Michael talked about his experiences working with some of the world's largest companies to help them to integrate, install, and manage their open source software. Michael has been a lead maintainer of the PostgreSQL community for over 25 years now, and so he shared some great insights into what he thinks the best practices are for enterprises working with open source communities. This podcast is sponsored by Open Teams, the first market network where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. Open Teams is your single source for everything open source. Now that the introductions are out of the way, let's cue the music. So, you are currently the CEO of Credativ, which is a service provider for open source software. And you've been a contributor to Debian and the PostgreSQL community for over 20 years now, is that correct?
That is correct. I started with Debian, I think in 95, maybe 94, somewhere in that range, and Postgres a little bit later. So yeah, It's more like 25 years now.
Wow, that's incredible. And I'm sure you've seen a lot change over the years, and I think we'll definitely dive into that in a bit. But can you give us an idea of how you got here today?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I started doing open source originally in my spare time while I was working on my PhD. I got into some of the pieces. I needed some software. I developed a little bit. I gave back. So the classical way you get into open source, way back when it was really easy. You send out an email, you tell somebody, I would like to help, and the reply is, here's your account, please change the password.
There was no PRs?
Yeah, that's fairly easy. I later found out the master server of Debian was literally standing below somebody's desk. Wow. That's it. So I got into this, as I said, while I was doing my PhD, and then got into, the real life, doing different jobs. And then late in 1999, the company I was working for, I was a branch manager, running the Western branch of a company based out of Hamburg. And the company was sold. And the company acquiring us wasn't really interested in the office in Düsseldorf. So me and my friend who was working for me said, okay, so what do we do? Look for a new job? Maybe we should look for something where we can keep working together. And then somebody came up with the idea, hey, why don't we do it on our own? Just give it a try. And we had a history in that job in quality assurance, quality management, and IT. And that combined with my personal interest in open source brought us there almost immediately, because even back then, the quality was better. You got less problems with open source software. We bootstrapped the company, so there is no, financing included. We did what we thought but made sense, and we did what we saw in the market and saw what was needed.
And so why did open source work better back then? Why did you say it was of higher quality?
Well, we're talking about the days of like Windows 98 and stuff.
Okay.
Obviously, the servers on Unix systems were high quality, but compared to some other software, open source already was of high quality. The way open source software is developed just results in higher quality. There are so many testers for this software because there are so many people using the software and using the bleeding edge version of it that you automatically get a better version, and you get the feedback. You get those testers, those users talk to the developers directly, or they are the developers, so they can really put it in. And the way I usually describe it is the classical software is often done, or was done in what they call a waterfall model, where you have the design and then the development and everything just falls down. And when you look at a real waterfall, what does it produce? It produces mist, and a lot of it. Interestingly enough, the same word, MIST, is also a German word, but means like crap in English.
Okay.
So
you don't want that.
Yeah. And this circle was already there in open source. So you have the feedback, and the software was good back then. And obviously, then people cut into it, saw the financial advantages, saw that they could get to market quicker with open source, and all the other advantages we see even nowadays.
What exactly is Credativ? I know that I mentioned before it's a service provider, but what are the other services you offer?
So the classical elevator pitch is we offer all these services for open source that a software vendor offers for their own software. That's like the whole lot, the whole 9 yards. But in reality, nowadays, back then we did literally all of open source. Nowadays, it's no longer possible.
Impossible.
We concentrate on everything that's infrastructure and databases. And most of the work we do is what we call support. It's not the standard industry definition of support. Standard industry definition of support is technical break fix. You find something where the software is broken, you tell the vendor and they fix it. But we found, we do that too, no problem with that. But most of the time the software is not broken. Most of the time they need users need operational support. They have to run the software, and they run into issues there. And if you're obviously, as a Postgres developer, I tend to use databases as an example quite frequently. If your database is too slow to react, you don't really care if it's a bug in the software or it's a missing tuning of the database itself or missing index or whatever. You just want to get it fixed so it's faster and produces the time or the results you need. So as a user, for you, that is the support ticket. This query is too slow. And we didn't want to say, well, this is not support, this is service, just contract us for consulting. So we put all of that into one single, what we call service and support contract, and do those operational support issue, or handle those operational support issues within the SLA as well.
How does the procurement process work? What does that look like for the customers that you work for?
Well, there are a lot of different setups. We still see that classical procurement process where procurement people want to buy like a subscription or a license, the way they know how to buy software or acquire software. But we also see people looking more for services, understanding open source more. Way back when, it was a real difficult thing to do, because everything you got was, okay, put the subscription price in here, send us the software for 2 months, we check it out, and if we like it, we pay. But in the open source world, you don't have that finished product all the time. There are a lot of times where you have different components and you need to combine them, to integrate them into one solution. That is the work you have to do, the service work, if you want to say so. But you have to do that, and you want to get paid for it, and not just do it and wait for them to pay for it. Nowadays, things have changed. A lot of procurement divisions understand open source, at least to a certain extent, and also because a lot of users go into cloud or cloud-like setups, they have a different approach. If you go to a big cloud provider and go for, let's say, a database as a service, you don't buy the software. You buy compute and storage and whatnot. It's just the software that runs uses your data or stores your data and runs your queries. But they only bill you for hardware resources, essentially. So the interesting thing, when cloud became cloud or a real thing, before cloud was a real thing, let's put it like that, people were approaching me in discussions and saying, oh, sorry, dude, your business model is going out of business, essentially, because nobody needs you anymore. The cloud providers will take care of it. But that's exactly what's not going to happen, didn't happen, and what the cloud providers explicitly don't want to do. They want to give you that database and maybe the backup for it, or the Kubernetes infrastructure. but they don't want to run it for you. They don't want to do a database health check or put the DBA in. A full service solution for them is something else as it is for us. For us, full service means if you have a secret problem in the database, we fix it for you. That is something the cloud provider doesn't want to do. But there are huge advantages for open source, because now these cloud providers develop features, develop software essentially. Kubernetes is a great example because it's completely coming out of that space. Because they need it to serve their customers, and there is no advantage for them for not open sourcing it because they don't sell it. There are huge possibilities for open source as compared to the old business models we saw in open source over the years.
Sometimes proprietary solutions or proprietary companies that are selling proprietary software, they try to trick you into buying their license in order to use open source components.
Some of those companies even claim they sell you an open source version and an open source license. But what they do is they take the open source, they claim it's their product, and they also claim you have to buy those proprietary pieces around it because otherwise you cannot use the open source version, which more often than not is just not true. Obviously, they want to sell their products. I'm fine with that. But it's not true what they're saying. It's not open. And the best example I've seen was that company being asked for, well, there was a problem running their product within a huge configuration management system. It's probably a very easy issue. I talked to my technical team and they immediately said, yeah, it's probably that. They have to change this. But their salesperson went into the customer and said, oh, yeah, that's a problem. You shouldn't use all that configuration management you put, I don't know, hundreds and thousands of man hours or man days into. Just throw it away and use our tools for that piece of software, and the rest we don't care. As you can imagine, they didn't go for the software. They just said, oh, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
And it's just not needed. And that's what I meant with the advent of cloud and the cloud providers changes things, because they don't have to go this fear, uncertainty, doubt route to sell something. In the other world, the classical world, there are good examples of companies doing open source, combining open source with proprietary pieces that give additional features. Very, very good companies, very good solutions. But unfortunately, there are also those, what do you call it, black sheep or whatever, that don't have the solution, or that don't have enough clients or customers interested, that they think they have to go different routes and use the old FUD arguments again. Obviously, sometimes it's just salespeople. They don't know the whole ecosystem, but sometimes there's even a concept behind it.
Do you think that's changing? Have you noticed that? Are there less companies that are doing that?
To be honest, it's quite the opposite. I've noticed more companies doing that. And that's why I hope so much for the cloud setups to change things. And it's not just the cloud providers, it's also the cloud technologies that you run on-prem. Because then the whole basis of your infrastructure is all open source anyway. And people who already base their whole infrastructure on open source are very tempted to keep everything open source as much as they can and not go for any proprietary piece if there is an alternative.
Can you give us an idea of who your customers are? I know you can't name specific names, but what do those customers look like?
Usually our customers are bigger companies. So we don't have that mom and pop shop around the corner. Just not our business. And we only do B2B. We don't have anything but companies. On the bigger end, we are up to, I don't know, Fortune 50 companies. And we have quite a few of those bigger global companies. But also we see the middle size, the company size of, I don't know, several thousand employees. And almost always it's very crucial infrastructure they want us to support them with. And what we also see more is a more global approach, more of a follow the sun approach, where those big players, I mean, they have somebody working on some systems around the clock, and not just in 3 shifts. They might have somebody sitting in your place, somebody in my area, and somebody in the States, for example. And they would like to have people available for them without calling somebody in the middle of the night their time. So this follow the sun approach is something that we see more and more.
What do you find is some of the biggest problems that these clients are facing?
I would say the biggest problem is that they have to scale up really fast. And you design a system for a certain size, and then suddenly the size triples or quadruples within a day. So you need to make sure the whole system scales as well. And especially in a database, you have to do quite a lot of things to figure out what's going on. I mean, it doesn't matter. You don't have to tune a database if you have like 1,000 records in there. It doesn't matter how you read them. It's fast. But if you have like 1,000 billion, then you have to tune a lot to make it fast. You have to make sure it's accessed in the right way. You have to see how does the application accesses and so on. So there's a huge point there. And the other thing that unfortunately a lot of people forget, at least in the initial go, is scaling up is fairly easy. You set something up, you set a threshold. If my CPU load goes over whatever, or my storage goes over whatever, just start another pod, another container, another system. What people tend to forget is at some point you have to shut it down again, or otherwise the cost will skyrocket.
Yeah.
So there is a give and take. You have to add new things, but you also have to remove things. And all of this should be automatic. Sometimes, actually a lot of our clients prefer to have the system on-prem, at least the main system, but then scale out into cloud, sometimes even into all 3 cloud providers for handling the load that suddenly comes up. So all of this has to be integrated.
Wow. Okay. And so you're the experts to go to when they need that to happen.
Yeah, that as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and focus on the idea of working with communities, because I know that's something you've done personally for 25 years, over 25 years now. And I know that a lot of companies now are more interested in working with open source communities. So first of all, though, I just wanted to touch on, just for those listening, what is PostgreSQL?
So PostgreSQL is, as we call it, the most advanced open source database. It's an object relational database, was developed in Berkeley by the same prof, not the same team, the same professor who did Ingress way back when. And then in, I think it was 95, Berkeley decided, that's it, we've done enough, and gave it away for the communities. And then a small community built, adding patches, fixing bugs, adding new features. And by now, we're at a point where I would say we can compete with all the major databases in the proprietary world. Obviously, it's not always 100%, but most of the time, most of the features are there. And this at more or less the same performance.
And when I was looking up, it sat around the top 3 open source database solutions.
Honestly, I don't know what the top 3 is. In my book, if you want a real full database, it has to be Postgres, because that's the only full database. And then you have a lot of NoSQL databases. You also have the whole MySQL tree, MariaDB, MySQL itself, and so on. All of these have their use cases. Don't get me wrong. But I personally prefer the really mission critical, business critical, big database. And for that, I believe Postgres is the best choice. And the interesting that you said about lots of companies wanting to work with communities. I think there's also a learning experience for those companies.
Yes.
Just the other day, I heard somebody talking about a feature they want to open source, or they're going to open source. And He gave me a ring before they announced it and said, "Yeah, you know what? I talked to my legal team, and the first thing they said, yeah, get somebody to sign the NDA." Well, there is not somebody who can sign for Postgres. Well, then get everyone to sign the NDA. No, that's not going to happen either.
How it works.
So, yeah, I get the point. I mean, legal is different and they know different setups. And a lot of companies don't know how to interact with communities. And there's still some misconception. I still get the occasional person who tells me that they don't believe in open source, that they think as soon as developers develop a social life, they will be gone and don't do open source anymore.
Wow. Okay.
It still happens.
Can you talk about the relationship that you yourself and Credativ have with PostgreSQL, and how does that benefit clients?
Yeah, so Postgres or other projects, we do have a lot of Debian developers. We have developers and committers in quite a lot of open source projects. We have one committer who's doing some stuff on the monitoring side with Isinga, and I actually was racking my brain about it just a couple of minutes ago for a different reason, but I couldn't come up with all the names. There were just too many. Yeah. With Postgres, I myself, I'm still a committer. I do have write access to the whole Postgres source code, although I don't find that much time anymore. I fixed the occasional bug, but I cannot do feature development anymore. Turns out running a company our size, we're about 90 people globally, takes away much more time than the day has. So there's not much time left for doing Postgres development. But obviously, we are still connected. We have several people who do Postgres work. Sometimes it's sending in patches. Sometimes it's debugging issues, answering queries on the mailing list, doing presentations. There are a lot of things the community needs, up to handling sponsorships and everything. So communities nowadays, the bigger ones, have quite a bit of cash available because they have to run the infrastructure and everything, but also for marketing issues. Somebody has to manage all that. Yeah. So some of our people are just involved. Like, just to give you an example, there's a huge website where the Postgres community and the Debian and the Ubuntu community got together, building packages for all active versions of Postgres, for all active versions of Debian and Ubuntu.
Wow.
We're talking about, I should have looked up the numbers, something like 20, 30,000 packages. Wow. And that's mostly run by one of my guys, for example. So you give back what you can give back, and then sometimes it's just our clients run into issues. So we fix it for them and then contribute that back. Or we work with the community to find a solution for the issue. It does benefit us. It does benefit the clients. What I don't think, but I've seen that quite frequently, I don't think a user needs a committer as a service provider, unless they want to do software development, feature development. And even then, it doesn't help because there is no committer, at least not in Postgres, who can just commit anything without going through a proper review with the whole community. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it just happens that people come to us or even to myself and say, well, here is a feature, I want that committed. Yeah, but there are issues. Yeah, it doesn't matter. I have a paying customer for that, just commit it. Yeah. I'm going to fix the problems afterwards. No, that's not the way community works. Mm-hmm. So I always see ourselves and other companies in the space, of course, yourself as well, as the translators between business or corporate speech and community speech. Yes. There are just different levels of needs and questions and answers, and sometimes we just need mediators or translators to get the communication going. But I agree that I see more and more corporate IT departments that want to get connected to open source communities. And also by hiring people, of course, which makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, you want to have some expertise yourself. You don't want to have the deep level expertise for everything. Usually you cannot. It's just too much. Mm-hmm. And your business is, I don't know, running accounts for your customers, running insurances or whatever your business is. it's not developing open source, but you need people to understand the basic issues, to fix most of it. And then if it goes down to a level where they cannot, there are people like us to fix those issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's definitely also a movement towards being a good corporate citizen, because like you said, for the reason of hiring is these people want to hire the open source contributors, which are in huge demand, very hard to come by. And the Googles and the Facebooks, they're all trying to snatch them up. But it's really, if you are interacting with communities, if you're allowing your developers to contribute back to communities, if you're offering training programs, then it's likely that those open source contributors will want to come and talk with you and work for you ultimately. So what are some of the best practices for corporations wanting to work with open source communities?
Oh yeah, that is a tricky question. I think there are different aspects to that. Yes, part of it is also financial, helping communities, sponsoring communities for whatever they need, sponsoring events. Like most communities have their developer meetings. And while it's easy for me to fly to a Debian developer meeting because I have a company backing me up, there are a lot of developers who don't have that, especially when they're still at university and need somebody to pay for it. So there's a travel grant, stuff like that. And then it's probably getting people who get into those communities and just help. It could be done by hiring people. Sometimes it's tricky. I mean, I used to do some kernel work. It's been a while. Actually, it's like 25 years ago. But anyway, I did some kernel work. And still, to the day, I sometimes get an inquiry whether I would want to do that work for some company. Yeah. So, yeah, the Linux kernel is a good example because there's more demand than experts. And it's difficult to get into it. But the same holds for everything. So if you were like a big corporate entity and you wanted to get into open source and be a good citizen there, you could certainly hire some of the major players in the community. Now, if all those players already have a job and they don't want to switch, you could also appoint some of your team to work with and inside the community. It takes longer, but you have to give them time to go into it or to get into it. And the third approach, obviously, is the one we are making our business is not based on, but it's also part of our business. You can hire a company like us to do that for you. They are already part of the community, and you can funnel everything you want to do through that, which we've seen quite a bit actually.
Yeah, and that's something which I think we believe is one of the best ways to go about it. You don't have to spend all this money hiring internally. You can go to a company that's experts in that field, like Credativ, or Quansight is one which the founder of Open Teams also is the CEO of. They focus on the PyData ecosystem and offering similar services to you around the PyData ecosystem. And they're well acquainted with these communities and they're already involved. So it definitely does make it more efficient and I think cost effective in the long run. And big companies are doing it these days. Some of the clients are considerably successful companies, and it's great to see that they're becoming bigger advocates of open source. And I think for a few decades now they have been, but they really, really are caring about open source communities more and more by the day. As we're getting towards the end, do something a little bit fun and pretend we're just jumping in a time machine and we're skipping forward and we're clicking a button that says, okay, we're jumping 10 years ahead of now. Where do you think open source is going to be?
Does it really have to be 10 years? It's kind of difficult to do that without going into science fiction here.
Yeah.
So if we go like I don't know, 3 years or 5 years in the future, I'm pretty positive that open source will be bigger, quite significantly bigger than it is now. And I think that the part I mentioned before about the cloud providers not selling open source, but using it, or even from personal experience, contracting with open source companies to help them sell some other open source tools and some other services there. there is no need anymore for those add-ons. There's no need anymore to develop intellectual property because you're selling that. And the need to develop IP has brought us to a point where some of those companies are just redeveloping the wheel. So you have somebody basing their software on open source X, and another company doing the same, and the third company doing the same. So they differentiate themselves by adding, I don't know, a backup tool. Let's say a backup tool, something more complex, but let's say a backup tool. So each one of them has a different backup tool, but we only need one.
Yeah.
And we already have one in open source as well. So they have developers that could improve the open source version, develop a new one again and again and again. So I hope that we get a little bit away from that approach and we get more into the pure open source world, the world where people collaborate instead of compete. And that, in my opinion, will give open source a huge boost. We will see more features because more companies see advantages. Back when we started, we were contracted to, let's say, set up a Linux server because nobody could do that. And it was fairly complicated. I still remember the times when you had to manually set mode lines in your Xconfig to even access the monitor. So installing on servers that weren't certified for Linux was really complicated. You had to find the right drivers. Sometimes they didn't even exist. Nowadays, that's completely out of the box. I mean, all the hardware vendors have their drivers in the Linux kernel, mostly at least. You just install it and it works. So there has been development in open source to take away that hurdle. And then you get to the next one and the next one. And we're getting further and further. Everything that coming commodity used to be complicated. And the more we get commodity, the better open source becomes. The more issues we have, the more opportunities we have, and the more features we get. There may be some software that is too niche or too complicated or too expensive to maintain to become fully open source. Maybe, could be. But so far, everything has moved there. And I'm pretty happy that I'm not in the business of developing proprietary software, because I'm not sure that is a business with a future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's open source is just going to continue to grow. I just wanted to jump back to this idea that you just mentioned, that is the companies are forking, and if I understood this correctly, they're forking open source projects to develop their own backup feature. How can companies collaborate?
Yeah, the thing is, if they want to develop their own backup feature because their unique selling point is their backup feature, then there's probably nothing to do about it because they would lose their unique selling point. But I would prefer to see something, well, probably kind of similar to what the Linux kernel has, where the hardware vendors work together and have different vendors have different developers in the same group developing a feature together that everyone uses. Yeah. Because they are not selling their hardware because of that feature, because other hardware has it too. They just need it to run. And we see the same in the cloud space. We see the same in so many different areas. And I hope we see even more of it. And we see less of this is my castle and I just shut down approach. I would prefer to see much more collaboration, much more openness. I get the point that people need to sell their software. I mean, they have to make a living. That's fine by me. And I'm fine with features that really bring another benefit. But the commodity pieces, at least, I hope people will work together on. We've seen that, for example, in the automotive space. We see huge car companies work together on the basis, on the operating system for the sat-nav, for the radio, whatever you have in there nowadays. Because nobody buys a car because this is running a better operating system than the other. You want the UI feature. Yeah, it makes a difference whether you can set your sat-nav easily or not. That makes a difference. But if the underlying system is Linux-based or proprietary or different Linux-based, Nobody cares. So they combine forces there, reduce cost, and get to market quicker. Which to me is exactly the move we want to see.
Definitely. And it's almost like the next phase of open source is enterprises almost having that open source ethos themselves, which I think is exciting.
If that happens within the next 10 years, it would be a great success. That would be awesome.
And I think open source will continue to thrive, which is our mission here at Open Teams.
Yeah, same for us. I think we are completely agreed there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michael. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And I know you're over in Germany right now. What time is it?
Well, we have 10 to 9.
10 to 9.
So as you can see around, it's dark.
It's dark. It is dark. It's dark. It's dark over there, morning here. So thank you for listening. If you liked what you listened today, then you can go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. And please leave a comment and also leave a review on Apple Podcasts, letting us know what you think. That really does show a lot of support for the show. So thanks very much, everyone. Until next time, see you later.
See ya.